The three men who would become the most famous crew in human history shook hands for the first time in a NASA conference room, and then went back to barely speaking to each other. Picture this, January 1969. A drab government conference room in Houston, Texas. Fluorescent lights hum overhead, casting that particular yellow-green glow that makes everyone look slightly ill. Three test pilots sit around a gray metal table, exchanging the kind of polite handshakes you give to strangers at a company mixer. The air smells of stale coffee and industrial carpet cleaner. Through the window, the flat Texas landscape stretches toward a horizon that seems impossibly far away. They have just been told they will fly Apollo 11. They will travel to the moon. They will become immortal. And they barely know each other. Emotion value 10/6 months. That was all the time they had. Think about that for a moment. You probably know your coworkers better than Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins knew each other when they strapped into a rocket bound for the moon. You have probably shared more meals with casual acquaintances than these three men shared during their entire preparation for humanity's greatest voyage. Michael Collins would later describe their relationship with devastating honesty. They were amiable strangers. Not brothers, not best friends, not even close colleagues who had worked their way up together through the Astronaut Corps. Just three exceptionally talented professionals thrown together by circumstance and deadline, bound by duty rather than devotion. Here's the thing that should make you question everything you assume about teamwork. It worked. The mission that required more precise coordination than any human endeavor in history was executed flawlessly by three men who barely spoke outside of training simulations. How is that even possible? What does it tell us about collaboration, trust, and the nature of professional excellence? And what happened to these amiable strangers after they achieved immortality together? The answers reveal something unexpected about what it really takes to accomplish the impossible. All three were born in 1930, within months of each other, into a Depression-era America that would shape their characters in remarkably similar ways. The economic devastation of those early years taught an entire generation self-reliance, discipline, and the value of quiet competence over flashy showmanship. Families learned to make do with less, to trust in hard work rather than luck, to measure success in accomplishments rather than words. Neil Armstrong arrived first, on August 5th, in small-town Wapakoneta, Ohio. He was quiet from the start, reserved. The kind of kid who earned his pilot's license before he could legally drive a car. 16 years old and already more comfortable in the sky than on the ground. While other teenagers were learning to parallel park, young Neil was learning to slip the surly bonds of Earth, feeling the stick respond to his touch, watching the Ohio farmland shrink beneath him until the world became a patchwork quilt of green and brown. Buzz Aldrin followed on January 20th in Montclair, New Jersey, to a father who was himself an aviation pioneer. The intensity that would define Aldrin's career was evident from the beginning. Even as a child, he attacked every challenge with a ferocity that sometimes alarmed his teachers. Second place was never acceptable. Achievement was not optional. Michael Collins came last, on October 31st, to a military family stationed in Rome, Italy, where duty and precision were not merely valued but required. The discipline of military life seeped into young Michael like ink into paper, but somehow left room for an easygoing nature that would serve him well in the years to come. Same generation, same historical moment. Vastly different paths that would not intersect for nearly 4 decades. Emotion value 10/Armstrong's journey to the astronaut corps wound through 78 combat missions over Korea. The Korean peninsula in 1951 was a landscape of frozen hills and burning villages, of MiG alley and flak-filled skies. Armstrong flew low over rice paddies and high through hostile airspace, learning lessons about fear and composure that no classroom could teach. Emotion value tense. Once, enemy fire tore away part of his wing. The aircraft shuddered and began to roll. Alarm lights flashed. The stick felt wrong in his hands. Any other pilot might have panicked. Armstrong did not. He nursed the crippled aircraft back to friendly territory and ejected safely. Calm, methodical, professional. His pulse barely rose. That composure would define everything he did afterward. After Korea came 7 years as a test pilot, first with the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, and then with its successor organization, NASA. Armstrong pushed the X-15 rocket plane to the edge of space itself, reaching altitudes where the sky turned black and the curvature of Earth became visible. He flew faster than 4,000 miles per hour. The cockpit would heat up until it glowed cherry red at the edges. The vibration would rattle his teeth. And, through it all, Armstrong maintained the same steady demeanor, the same careful attention to procedure, the same absolute focus on getting the job done. He experienced engine failures, control malfunctions, and situations that would have panicked lesser pilots. Each time, he responded with the same quiet competence that had saved him over Korea. Have you ever met someone who seems genuinely unflappable? Someone who treats every crisis with the same calm attention they would give to making breakfast? Armstrong was that person. Collins later described him as someone who savors decisions carefully, calling him a classy guy. But classy and close are not the same thing. Armstrong was uncomfortable with celebrity, consistently declining interviews and public appearances even after becoming the first human to walk on the moon. He kept people at arm's length not from coldness but from genuine preference for solitude. What drives a person to seek silence when the world wants to celebrate them? What kind of mind finds more comfort in equations and procedures than in human connection? These questions would define Armstrong's post-lunar life in ways no one anticipated. Aldrin took a completely different route. Where Armstrong was quiet, Aldrin was intense. Where Armstrong avoided confrontation, Aldrin seemed to welcome intellectual combat. Third in his class at West Point in 1951, he carried the competitive drive of someone who measured everything, including himself, against absolute standards. 2 enemy MiG-15s shot down during the Korean War proved his combat credentials. Those kills were not just victories, they were validation. But then came something unusual for a fighter jock: graduate school at MIT, a doctorate in astronautics. While other pilots were climbing the military ranks or testing new aircraft, Aldrin disappeared into the libraries and laboratories of Cambridge, Massachusetts. His thesis focused on orbital rendezvous techniques, the precise calculations required to make 2 spacecraft meet in the void. Page after page of mathematics describing trajectories, burn times, approach angles, the smell of chalk dust and coffee, the scratch of pencil on paper, the satisfaction of solving problems that had never been solved before. His colleagues at NASA gave him a nickname that captured both respect and gentle mockery: Dr. Rendezvous. The name stuck because it was accurate. Aldrin understood orbital mechanics the way some people understand music or poetry. He could see the invisible paths that objects traced through space, could calculate intersections that other engineers needed computers to find. But Aldrin wanted more than competence. He wanted recognition. He wanted to be first. That desire would shape his experience of Apollo 11 in ways he could never have anticipated. Collins chose the military path as well, attending West Point before becoming an Air Force test pilot at Edwards Air Force Base in the California desert. Unlike Armstrong's natural aptitude or Aldrin's driven intensity, Collins approached flying with what he called pleasure and wonder. The easygoing pilot who could handle anything because he never let anything get to him. Edwards, in the late 50s, was a place where the impossible became routine. Test pilots pushed aircraft beyond their designed limits, broke sound barriers, climbed to altitudes where the air grew thin and the sky turned dark. Some died doing it. Others became legends. Collins watched both outcomes and decided that the key to survival was not luck but preparation. You studied the aircraft. You knew its systems. You planned for every contingency. And then you flew, trusting your training to see you through. NASA rejected him the first time he applied. The rejection stung. But Collins simply came back the next year and made it, joining the third astronaut class in October 1963 alongside Aldrin. His Gemini 10 mission with John Young in 1966 set a world record altitude of 475 miles and featured 2 spacewalks. Collins became the third American to venture outside a spacecraft in Earth orbit, floating in the void with nothing but a suit between him and instant death. He described the experience with characteristic understatement: impressive, but manageable. Nothing to get excited about. That response tells you everything you need to know about Michael Collins. 3 extraordinarily capable men. 3 distinct personalities. 3 completely separate career trajectories that never intersected until NASA threw them together for humanity's greatest mission. Emotion value 10/ Now imagine the situation from NASA's perspective. Emotion value 10. You have to choose 3 astronauts for the most important mission in history. The whole world will be watching. The Soviet Union is racing to beat you. The president's promise hangs over everything. Kennedy's words from 1961 echo through every planning meeting before this decade is out. You need a commander who will stay calm under impossible pressure. You need a lunar module pilot who understands the orbital mechanics better than anyone alive. You need a command module pilot who can operate alone in lunar orbit and dock with a spacecraft he cannot see approaching. Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins fit those requirements perfectly. The fact that they had never worked together, had barely met, had completely different personalities and communication styles. Secondary considerations at best. The mission came first. Always the mission. Have you ever been assigned to a team where you did not choose your partners? Where you had to produce something extraordinary with people you had never worked with before, under a deadline that seemed impossible? Emotion value 10/ That was Apollo 11. Except the stakes were not a presentation or a product launch. The stakes were their lives. The stakes were humanity's destiny. Emotion value 10. Collins described the training program as almost frantic. 6 months to prepare for the most complex mission ever attempted. 6 months to transform 3 strangers into a unit capable of split-second coordination across 250,000 miles of void. 6 months to learn every system, every procedure, every contingency plan for every failure mode that NASA's engineers could imagine. But here is what made their situation even stranger. The training itself kept them apart. The Apollo spacecraft was actually 2 separate vehicles. The command module Columbia, which Collins would pilot, required 1 complete set of skills and simulations. The lunar module Eagle, which Armstrong and Aldrin would fly to the surface, required completely different expertise. So while the world imagined 3 best friends preparing for their great adventure together, the reality was 2 separate training tracks that rarely crossed. 2 separate buildings on the NASA campus. 2 separate instructor teams. 2 separate simulation facilities humming with the electronic sounds of mock emergencies and practiced responses. Armstrong and Aldrin spent their days in the lunar module simulator, a contraption that looked like a giant insect standing on metal legs, hour after hour, day after day. They rehearsed the 12-minute journey from lunar orbit to the surface. They learned to respond to every alarm, every malfunction, every unexpected reading. They practiced until the procedures were automatic, until they could execute them perfectly even when exhausted, even when stressed, even when simulation supervisors threw problems at them faster than seemed humanly possible. But the simulator smelled of electronics and sweat. The controls were identical to the real spacecraft. The windows showed projected images of the lunar surface approaching. And through it all, Armstrong and Aldrin worked side by side without ever really getting to know each other. Meanwhile, Collins mastered the command module systems that would keep him alive during his solo orbit around the moon. He learned to operate every switch, every gauge, every communication system. He practiced docking procedures that required him to guide two spacecraft together with tolerances measured in inches. He memorized contingency plans for rescuing his crewmates if their ascent from the lunar surface went wrong. They ate meals separately. They studied separately. They simulated separately. The training schedule had no room for bonding exercises or team-building retreats. Emotion value 10/ we were all business, Collins recalled. We were all hard work, and we felt the weight of the world upon us. That weight was quite literal. 3 billion people would watch their attempt. Hundreds of thousands of NASA and contractor employees had dedicated years of their lives to this moment. The president's promise hung over everything, and under that crushing pressure, some teams might have bonded intensely. Shared dinners would have become therapy sessions. Late-night conversations would have built emotional connections. The brotherhood that combat veterans describe might have formed naturally. The Apollo 11 crew did none of that. Why not? Was something wrong with them? Were they somehow emotionally deficient? Consider another possibility. What if their professional distance was not a weakness, but a strength? Emotion value 10/ simulation went wrong during training. Communication broke down between the lunar module and command module teams. Instructions were misunderstood. Timing was off. The kind of miscommunication that, during the actual mission, could have killed all three of them. In the debrief afterward, they could have responded by spending more personal time together, building rapport, developing the kind of intuitive understanding that comes from deep friendship. Instead, they implemented new coordination protocols. Professional, efficient, impersonal. They refined the communication procedures until every word had a specific meaning. Every exchange followed a specific format. Every handoff was explicitly confirmed. They did not try to become friends. They tried to become flawless. Think about the most effective team you have ever worked with. Was it the one where everyone hung out after work? Or the one where everyone showed up prepared, communicated clearly, and trusted each other's competence without needing to validate it through social bonding? The Apollo 11 crew bet humanity's future on the second model. Launch day arrived July 16th, 1969. The sun rose over Cape Kennedy, burning away the morning mist that clung to the Florida marshland. The air was thick with humidity and anticipation. Millions of spectators crowded the beaches, their cars parked for miles along every available road. They had brought lawn chairs and binoculars, coolers full of cold drinks and sandwiches. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders, too young to understand what they were witnessing, old enough to remember it forever. The Saturn V rocket stood 36 stories tall against the brightening sky, the most powerful machine humans had ever built. It gleamed white and black in the morning light, vapors streaming from its cryogenic fuel tanks. Searchlights played across its surface. The launch tower stood beside it like a loyal servant, providing umbilicals of fuel and electricity until the final moments. Inside the spacecraft, Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins suited up separately in different parts of the preparation facility. They went through medical checks and equipment verifications. They ate the traditional pre-flight breakfast of steak and eggs. And then they rode the elevator up the launch tower, stepping into the tiny capsule that would be their home for the next 8 days. They entered Columbia together, one by one through the narrow hatch, and strapped in for the ride of their lives. The couch fabric pressed against their backs. The instrument panels glowed with hundreds of lights and gauges. The smell was distinctive, a mixture of pure oxygen and new spacecraft. Clean but mechanical. Their final interactions before ignition were brief, professional. Confirmation of system status. Acknowledgement of readiness. The kind of exchange you might have with a competent stranger who happens to be sitting next to you on an airplane. Except this airplane was going to the moon. At 9:32 in the morning, the Saturn V's 5 F1 engines ignited. The sound was apocalyptic. People miles away felt the vibration in their chests. The launch tower swung away. 7.5 million pounds of thrust pushed the stack skyward, rising on a pillar of flame so bright it hurt to watch. A motion value tense inside the capsule. The G-forces pressed them into their couches. The vibration shook them until their vision blurred. Every loose object rattled. The noise was deafening even through their helmets. And then, suddenly, the first stage cut off, and they were thrown forward against their straps before the second stage ignited and pushed them back again. Then silence, weightlessness. They were coasting toward a destination no human had ever reached. The journey to the moon took 3 days. 3 days in a spacecraft smaller than a minivan. 3 days in microgravity, where every movement had to be careful and deliberate. 3 days with 2 people you barely knew. Your entire world reduced to a few cubic meters of cramped space. Imagine the longest road trip of your life. Then multiply the confinement by a factor of 1,000. Do they pass the time with navigation checks, system monitoring, and the occasional meal of rehydrated food squeezed from plastic pouches? The food was technically nutritious, but barely appetizing. Paste that was supposed to taste like beef stew. Cubes that claimed to be bread. Everything had to be eaten carefully because crumbs in zero gravity could float into equipment and cause problems. Not with heart-to-heart conversations or bonding exercises. Not with stories from their childhoods or dreams for their futures. The mission came first. Always the mission. On July 19th, Apollo 11 entered lunar orbit. Through the spacecraft windows, the moon filled their view, gray and ancient and waiting. Craters pocked its surface like frozen explosions. Mountains rose and fell in gentle curves. And somewhere down there, in a flat plain called the Sea of Tranquility, their destination awaited. And with it came the separation that would transform their professional distance into something far more profound. What happens when professional detachment becomes physical isolation? When the colleagues you barely know become the only link between you and total solitude? Emotion value 10/Collis prepared to watch Armstrong and Aldrin descend to the lunar surface. He would remain in Columbia, orbiting above, waiting for them to return, if they returned. No one had ever landed on the moon before. The descent stage had never been tested under actual lunar gravity. The ascent engine, which would lift Armstrong and Aldrin back to orbit, had no backup. If it failed to fire, there was nothing anyone could do. No rescue mission. No alternative plan. Just Collins flying home alone while 2 colleagues died slowly on an airless world 250,000 miles from home. Emotion value 10/NASA had prepared him for this possibility. They had given him a checklist titled Solo Book that detailed procedures for returning to Earth as the sole survivor of Apollo 11. Think about that. The space agency had planned for Collins to abandon his crewmates on the moon and fly home by himself. Emotion value 10/the farewell, such as it was, lasted seconds. "See you later," Collins said as his crewmates floated through the tunnel to the lunar module. Not goodbye. Test pilots never say goodbye. That would be admitting the possibility of failure. And test pilots do not admit that possibility until the moment it becomes inescapable fact. "See you later" insists on a future reunion, even when that reunion is far from guaranteed. Emotion value 10/ Armstrong and Aldrin crawled through the tunnel connecting the two spacecraft. They sealed the hatches behind them with a final metallic click. The docking latches released with a mechanical clunk. Eagle separated from Columbia. Through Columbia's windows, Collins watched his crewmates drift away toward a destination he would never touch. What went through his mind in that moment? Did he wish he knew them better? Did he regret the months of professional distance that had kept them strangers? Or did he simply trust their competence as thoroughly as he trusted his own? Collins later revealed he had prepared to return to Earth alone. Not emotionally prepared, though perhaps that too. Procedurally prepared. He had practiced the maneuvers. He had memorized the navigation solutions. He had made peace with the possibility that the most famous mission in history might end with one survivor carrying home the memories of two dead colleagues. Emotion value 10/ the descent began. Armstrong and Aldrin fell toward the Sea of Tranquility, while Collins circled above. In mission control, 400 flight controllers monitored every number on their consoles. They calculated every trajectory. They held their collective breath. Dana Krantz, the flight director whose white vest would become iconic, sat at his console with absolute authority. His decisions were final. His word was law. Chris Kraft, who had established the flight director role during Mercury and Gemini, had famously declared, "No one can overrule me while the mission is underway. I'm flight, and flight is God." Charlie Duke, the capsule communicator whose southern drawl would be the last voice the astronauts heard before touchdown, waited at his station. He had developed the activation and checkout procedures for the lunar module itself, giving him expertise that few others possessed. He was the bridge between 400 controllers in Houston and two astronauts descending toward another world. Then the alarms started. 12:01, 12:02. Computer overload warnings flashing on the guidance displays. The numbers that the astronauts needed for navigation were being interrupted. The computer was struggling to keep up with its workload. What do you do when the computer controlling your spacecraft starts throwing error codes? When you are descending toward an airless moon at high speed, and the machine that is supposed to guide you starts warning that something is wrong? Emotion value 10/Zine mission control. Guidance officer Steve Bales had perhaps 3 seconds to decide whether to abort the mission or trust his backroom experts. 3 seconds to weigh years of preparation against flashing warning lights. 3 seconds to make a call that would either save or doom the most watched human endeavor in history. Emotion value 10/ behind Bales sat 26-year-old Jack Garman, a computer specialist who had memorized every alarm code the system could generate. He recognized 12:01 and 12:02 instantly. The computer was being asked to do too much, but it was prioritizing correctly. It would drop less important tasks to focus on guidance. The mission could continue. Go. One word from Bales. One word that trusted Garmin. One word that Kranz accepted without hesitation. One word that kept the mission alive. A chain of professional trust, not personal friendship. that stretched from Houston to the lunar surface. Emotion value tenth/theth descent continued. But now Armstrong saw something the computer could not evaluate. The landing zone was strewn with boulders the size of automobiles, jagged rocks that would destroy the lunar module on contact. He took manual control, flying Eagle like a helicopter across the lunar surface, searching for a clear spot to land. Fuel reserves dwindled with every second of additional flight time. Emotion value tenth/Eagle, 60 seconds. Emotion value tenth/Duke's voice came through from CAPCOM, steady despite the tension that had the entire room holding their breath, literally holding their breath. Duke would later recall that the whole mission control room was just holding our breath during those final moments. Then 30 seconds. Eagle, 30 seconds. Emotion value tenth/Armstrong found his spot, a small clearing amid the boulder field. He guided Eagle down with the precision of a helicopter pilot landing on a rooftop in a storm. Contact lights illuminated as the probes beneath the landing pads touched lunar soil. Houston. Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Duke's response captured the relief of 400 controllers who had just witnessed the impossible. Roger. Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. Armstrong set the lunar module down with perhaps 20 seconds of fuel remaining. Not because he knew Aldrin as a friend, but because he trusted him as a professional. Their relationship had been designed for exactly this moment. Above them, orbiting alone, Collins heard the news. His colleagues had made it. The men he barely knew had just accomplished what humanity had dreamed of since the first humans looked up at the night sky and wondered. Now came the wait. 21 hours while Armstrong and Aldrin explored the surface. 21 hours while Collins orbited alone in Columbia, passing behind the moon where no radio signal could reach him, experiencing a solitude no human had ever known. On the far side of the moon, completely cut off from all contact with humanity, Collins contemplated his situation with characteristic clarity. The score would be 3 billion plus 2 over on the other side of the moon, and 1 plus God only knows what on this side. 3 billion humans on Earth, 2 humans on the lunar surface, 1 human utterly alone on the far side, surrounded by silence so complete that even his own thoughts seemed loud. What does that kind of isolation do to a person? Collins insisted he felt no loneliness. He described awareness, anticipation, satisfaction, confidence, almost exultation. The professional distance that had characterized his relationship with Armstrong and Aldrin extended naturally to this ultimate separation. He was doing his job. They were doing theirs. But something shifted during those hours. Collins found himself thinking not about the lunar surface he would never touch, not about his colleagues bouncing in 1/6 gravity below him, but about the Earth he could see from 230,000 miles away. A fragile place, he called it, blue and white and impossibly beautiful against the black void of space. The overview effect, psychologists would later call it. The perspective that comes from seeing your entire world as a single, vulnerable sphere floating in darkness. That insight, born from professional isolation rather than personal connection, transformed Collins in ways that years of friendship with his crewmates never could have. Meanwhile, Armstrong descended the ladder and took his famous step. The lunar surface was unlike anything on Earth. Gray powder that clung to everything, rocks that had never known rain or wind, shadows that were absolute black because there was no atmosphere to scatter light. That's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind. The deliberate humility of that phrase, crediting all mankind rather than himself, matched his character perfectly. He was not claiming the moon. He was accepting it on humanity's behalf. Aldrin joined him 19 minutes later. "Beautiful, beautiful," he said, bouncing across terrain no human had ever touched. The 1/6 gravity made walking strange but exhilarating. They planted the flag. Its fabric stiffened with wire so it would appear to wave in the airless void. They collected samples, scooping up rocks and soil that would revolutionize planetary science. They set up scientific instruments that would continue to send data back to Earth for years. They accomplished every objective with the precision of professionals who had trained for exactly this moment. But here is what they did not do. They did not share the kind of emotional moment that movies would later invent for them. No meaningful glances across their helmet visors. No brotherly embraces in their bulky spacesuits. Just two specialists doing their jobs on an alien world. Emotion value, tent/the ascent engine fired. Eagle rose from Tranquility Base. Collins watched through Columbia's window, ready to dock if they made it, ready to go home alone if they did not. They made it. The docking procedure went perfectly. Armstrong and Aldrin crawled back through the tunnel, bringing lunar samples and the knowledge that they had just changed human history. Three amiable strangers, reunited after the most extraordinary separation in human experience. And what did they do? They continued the mission. Professional, focused, efficient. Personal feelings could wait. The journey home took another 3 days. Did they finally bond? Did they share their feelings about what they had accomplished? Collins's answer was characteristically honest. Not really. They talked about technical matters. They reviewed mission data. They remained the same amiable strangers they had been at the beginning. Splashdown came on July 24th in the Pacific Ocean. The world erupted in celebration. Streets filled with cheering crowds in cities around the globe. The three astronauts entered quarantine together, spending 21 days confined in a trailer while scientists ensured they had not brought back lunar pathogens. 21 days. More time together than their entire training period had provided. Finally, an opportunity to become the brothers in arms that the public imagined them to be. They played cards. They shared stories. They became, in Collins's words, something more than colleagues, but not much more. The habits of professional distance that had carried them to the moon and back did not dissolve simply because the mission was over. When quarantine ended, their paths diverged as completely as they had before NASA threw them together. Armstrong retreated from public life almost immediately. He taught aerospace engineering at the University of Cincinnati. He served on corporate boards. He consistently declined the celebrity status that his accomplishment had thrust upon him. The first man on the moon became famous for not wanting to be famous. He emphasized that Apollo 11's triumph belonged to 400,000 NASA and contractor workers rather than 3 astronauts. That deflection was not false modesty. It was genuine belief. The mission had succeeded because of institutional excellence, not individual heroism. Armstrong died on August 25th, 2012, at age 82. His funeral was attended by thousands who had never met him but felt they knew him. Aldrin struggled in ways no one had anticipated. The man who had been second on the moon found that distinction harder to bear than being first or third. At 39, he believed he had nothing left to accomplish. The peak had been reached. Where do you go from the moon? Depression followed. Then alcoholism. Then years of struggle he courageously revealed in his 1973 autobiography, Return to Earth. Speaking publicly about mental health struggles in the early 70s took extraordinary bravery for a military man. The stigma was immense. The pressure to maintain a heroic image was crushing. But Aldrin told the truth anyway, possibly helping countless others who struggled in silence. He eventually found redemption in advocacy. He became the astronaut corps' most dedicated promoter of future exploration, constantly pushing for missions to Mars, refusing to let humanity's spacefaring ambitions die. Today, in his 90s, he continues that advocacy with the same intensity that earned him the nickname Dr. Rendezvous. Collins found peace in ways his crewmates could not. He served as director of the National Air and Space Museum, shaping how Americans would understand their aviation and space heritage. He wrote a memoir, Carrying the Fire, praised for its literary quality and emotional honesty. When asked if he wanted to return to the moon, his response became legendary: "Been there, done that." The easygoing pilot who had orbited alone seemed most comfortable with his place in history. He had not walked on the lunar surface, and that was fine. He had gained something his crewmates missed, that view of Earth as a fragile blue marble, a perspective born from solitude. Collins died on April 28, 2021, at age 90, having outlived both his crewmates from his days of solitary orbit. What happened to their relationships with each other? They attended anniversaries together. They appeared at memorials. They spoke kindly of one another in interviews. But they never became close friends. They never developed the brotherhood that the public assumed they shared. They remained, until the end, amiable strangers. Does that diminish their achievement? Or does it reveal something important about what excellence really requires? Consider the modern parallels. Remote work teams achieving extraordinary results without ever meeting in person. Surgical teams performing flawlessly with specialists who assembled that morning and will never work together again. Crisis response units saving lives with operators who have never trained together. International space station crews from different countries living together in space for months, connected by procedure rather than personal history. The Apollo 11 crew proved that professional trust can substitute for personal connection, that clear role definition can replace intuitive understanding, that shared commitment to a goal larger than any individual relationship can bind people more effectively than friendship ever could. This is not to say personal bonds are worthless. Many teams function best when members know each other deeply. The creative partnerships that produce great art. The scientific collaborations that produce breakthrough discoveries. The business relationships that produced world-changing companies often depended on deep personal connection. But Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins demonstrated another path. They showed that when the mission is clear enough, when the training is rigorous enough, when the professional standards are high enough, strangers can accomplish miracles. Though too late as their approach had costs. Aldrin's struggles suggest that professional distance provides no support when the mission ends. Armstrong's retreat from public life indicates that shared achievement does not automatically create shared understanding. Yet their approach also had advantages. No interpersonal drama complicated their training. No emotional expectations created pressure beyond what the mission itself demanded. They could focus entirely on competence because they had nothing else to distract them. Maybe the greatest achievement in human history was accomplished not by best friends, but by the ultimate professional team. Maybe that is the real lesson of Apollo 11. The amiable strangers reached the moon because they trusted each other's expertise, not each other's hearts. They succeeded because they were excellent, not because they were close. They made history because they showed up prepared, communicated clearly, and executed flawlessly under pressure that would have broken teams bound by weaker foundations than professional discipline. Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. 3 men born in the same year, trained for the same mission, launched toward the same destination. Three strangers who proved that sometimes the most effective teams are the ones that do not need friendship to function. They walked together into immortality. And then, having accomplished the impossible, they walked back into their separate lives, carrying private memories of a shared experience that would forever define them in the public imagination, but never quite connect them to each other. Amiable strangers. To the end. And maybe, just maybe, that was exactly what the mission required.